Picture a coffee shop in Burbank, California. Tuesday morning, November 1971. A woman named Dorothy Myers is standing at the end of a four-table section, holding a ceramic pot of Folgers in her left hand and a handwritten bill in her right. She is 43 years old. She has been on her feet since 5:30 in the morning. Her uniform is starched and white. Her shoes have seen better years. She is looking down at something in her hand. Not the bill, not the coffee pot. Something folded, something she does not yet fully understand. Her lips are parted. Her eyes are fixed. And for exactly 4 seconds, she does not move. Around her, the breakfast rush is doing what breakfast rushes do. Ceramic cups scraping saucers, men in work shirts reading the morning paper, the smell of bacon and industrial coffee cutting through the cold air from the front door. Nobody is watching her. Nobody in the room knows what she is holding. Nobody understands that in 4 seconds, this woman's life has quietly, permanently shifted on its axis. She looks up. She looks toward the booth by the window. The man who sat there is already gone. All that remains is a folded paper napkin, a coffee cup half-drained, and a $100 bill placed flat beneath a saucer. She has no idea who left it. This is that story. The year 1971 was not a gentle one for the working people of the San Fernando Valley. The aerospace industry, which had employed hundreds of thousands of Southern California workers through the peak NASA years of the 1960s, had contracted sharply. Lockheed's Burbank facility alone had cut its workforce by more than 40% between 1969 and 1971, shedding over 20,000 jobs in less than 30 months. The ripple effect moved through neighborhoods like Burbank, Glendale, and North Hollywood in ways that don't make front-page news. In the form of tighter grocery budgets, second jobs, children who noticed that their parents smiled differently than they used to. Dorothy Myers was not an aerospace worker, but her husband had been. Robert Myers had worked a floor supervisor position at a Lockheed subcontractor in Canoga Park for 11 years. When the contract ended in the spring of 1970, he had 48 hours' notice. Dorothy took the waitressing job at Ernie's coffee shop on Magnolia Boulevard 3 weeks later. Not temporarily. Permanently. Ernie's was not a glamorous establishment. It occupied a single-story building between a dry cleaner and a hardware supply store, about 2 miles east of the Warner Brothers lot. It seated 41 people across 9 tables and a counter with 8 stools. The lunch crowd was decent. Studio workers, city employees, a regular contingent of retired men who nursed coffee for 90 minutes and tipped in nickels. The breakfast crowd was smaller, but more reliable. Dorothy ran a 4-table section, worked Tuesday through Saturday, and made between $18 and $22 in tips on a good day. On a bad day, she made $9. November 16th, 1971 was a Tuesday. It was not, by any early measure, shaping up to be a good day. Dorothy had already dealt with a 4-top that stiffed her on a $9 check, a cook who'd burned 2 consecutive orders of eggs over easy and blamed the burner, and a counter stool that wobbled badly enough that a customer had nearly gone over backward and threatened to call the health department. The morning had the specific low-grade grind of a day designed to cost you energy without giving any back. At approximately 7:55 in the morning, the front door opened. The man who walked in was large, 6 feet 4 inches, 220 pounds, moving with the particular unhurried deliberateness of someone who has never needed to rush to prove a point. He was wearing a plain work jacket, dark brown, slightly weathered, a flannel shirt, and dark trousers. No tie. No watch visible. His hair was gray at the temples and combed back without fuss. He carried nothing. He did not look around the room the way people look around a room when they want to be seen. He looked around the room the way a man looks around a room when he is deciding where to sit. He chose the booth by the window, second from the front, left side. A 2-person booth with a clear sight line to Magnolia Boulevard and to the front door simultaneously. He sat with his back to the wall. He did not pick up the laminated menu. He set both hands flat on the table and looked out the window. Dorothy picked up her coffee pot and walked over. She was not a starstruck woman. She had worked near the studios long enough to have served character actors, grip supervisors, junior executives, and the occasional recognizable face without making a fuss. She believed, correctly, that people who came to Ernie's came to eat without being bothered. That was the unspoken contract of the place, and she honored it. She did not recognize the man in booth 2. She noticed his hands, because she always noticed hands. 20 years of service work teaches you to read a table by its hands. His were large. Not soft. The knuckles had the slight permanence of repeated use, the kind of hands that had done actual physical work over decades, not the smooth hands of a man who handled paper for a living. The left hand had a faint scar along the outer edge, old and well-healed. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you were standing 18 inches away with a coffee pot and nothing else to focus on. She turned over his cup and poured. He looked at the stage of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion and accepted the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance in True Grit. His first Oscar, at age 62, after more than 200 films. She had no idea that the man who ordered wheat toast and eggs over easy in her four-table section on a Tuesday morning in November 1971 was John Wayne. But here's where it changes. John Wayne did not come to Ernie's coffee shop by accident. He was not lost. He was not killing time between appointments at Warner Brothers. He was, in a very specific and deliberate sense, exactly where he intended to be. Wayne had been filming a production near the Burbank area that week, a television appearance connected to promotional work for his upcoming project. And he had a particular habit, documented by several members of his production team and personal circle over the years, of finding local diners in the neighborhoods around studio lots rather than eating at commissaries or the kind of expense account restaurants where actors and executives performed their lunches at each other. His son Michael Wayne, who served as his producing partner through much of the 1960s and 70s, would later note that his father had an almost anthropological interest in working-class eating establishments. He liked the coffee. He liked the noise level. He liked the fact that people were generally too busy to bother him. He had been to Ernie's at least twice before. Not regularly enough to be a fixture. Enough to know the booth by the window was the right one. What John Wayne noticed when he sat down on the morning of November 16, 1971, was not the decor. Not the coffee. Not the slightly uneven tile near the counter that had been waiting for repair since the previous spring. What he noticed was the waitress. Not in any sentimental or romantic sense. Wayne was not a man given to those kinds of observations about strangers. What he noticed, with the specific perceptiveness of a man who had spent 40 years watching people perform and people be authentic and learning the difference, was the quality of her fatigue. There is a kind of tiredness that is just physical, the tiredness of someone who worked a long shift and needs sleep. Then there is a different kind of tiredness entirely, the kind that sits behind a person's professional courtesy like a weight they are balancing with both hands, while trying to appear as if they are not balancing anything. Wayne recognized it because he had seen it throughout his life, on ranch hands in Arizona, on extras who'd been waiting in the sun for 6 hours, on his own mother in the years after his father's health began to fail. It was the tiredness of someone managing a life that had gotten harder than they'd planned for, and was still getting up every morning and doing the work anyway. He watched Dorothy Myers carry herself across that coffee shop floor, efficiently, without complaint, stopping at the foretop by the counter to refill without being asked, handling the wobbling stool situation with the practiced diplomacy of someone who had defused that exact situation 12 times before. And he formed an assessment that required no additional information. He ate his breakfast without event. The eggs were slightly overdone. He did not mention it. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He read nothing. He watched Magnolia Boulevard through the window with the steady attention of a man for whom sitting still is not the same as doing nothing. When Dorothy brought the check, he said thank you again. Same voice. Same register. She set the check on the table and turned to go. She had taken 3 steps when something made her turn back. Not a sound. Not her name. Something she would spend years trying to describe accurately and never quite managed to. She turned back. The man in the booth was standing. He had set the check on the table with what appeared to be bills folded inside it, the normal gesture of a customer settling up. He had set something else on the table as well, something flat beneath the saucer. He was buttoning the top button of his jacket. He looked at her across 6 feet of linoleum. He said, "You run a good section." He said it the way a foreman says it. The way a person says something they have decided is true after watching carefully, and not before. Then he walked to the front of the restaurant, pushed the door open with one hand, and was gone. Dorothy stood there. She walked to the booth. She picked up the folded check. The bills inside were correct. The meal had been $3.40, and he had left $4 in the fold, a reasonable tip for the time. She almost missed the other thing entirely, because her eyes went to the receipt first, the way you do when you're in the middle of a shift and your mind is on the next table. Then she saw the $100 bill under the saucer. Flat. Deliberate. left to be found only after he was gone. She stood there for 4 seconds. The room kept going around her. Nobody noticed. Nobody knew. She looked at the door. She looked at the bill. She looked at the door again. The man was gone. Now, to understand what that $100 meant in November 1971, you need a number in your hand. The federal minimum wage in 1971 was $1.60 per hour. Dorothy Myers, on a Tuesday breakfast shift running from 5:30 to 2 in the afternoon, earned her hourly wage plus whatever tips she cleared. A $100 bill on a $4 check was, by the standards of that morning, an act of such specific and deliberate generosity that it essentially constituted the equivalent of a full week's wages handed silently under a saucer and walked away from. Wayne said nothing about it. He made no gesture toward it while he was there. He had not made eye contact during the payment. He had simply left it. This is not an accident, and it is not a mystery, but it is worth sitting with for a moment, because the mechanism behind the gesture is what separates it from charity and from performance. It was neither. John Wayne was not a charitable man in the organized institutional sense. He was not a regular donor to formal organizations, not a public philanthropist who attended galas and attached his name to buildings. What he was throughout his life, with a consistency documented by the people who worked closest to him, was observationally honest about the people directly in front of him. His longtime stuntman and friend Chuck Roberson, who worked alongside Wayne on more than 40 productions across 3 decades, described this quality in terms that are specific enough to be useful. Roberson noted that Wayne had what Roberson called a rancher's economy when it came to people, meaning he assessed what was needed, determined if he was in a position to provide it, and provided it without discussion. Not because it would be noticed, not because it would be remembered, because it was the correct response to the situation as he understood it. The philosophical architecture underneath that behavior is worth examining, because it shows up not just in a coffee shop in Burbank, but across the whole shape of the man's life. Wayne had grown up with a father who was chronically ill and economically fragile. Clyde Morrison's health troubles began when John, then Marion Morrison, was still in early school years, and the family's move from Winterset, Iowa, to Glendale, California, and then to the Mojave Desert, was driven at least partly by the search for a dry climate that would ease Clyde's lung condition. The family was not poor in the destitute sense, but they were consistently operating without margin. Marion Morrison learned to work early. He delivered newspapers on horseback before school. He learned to read a situation not with sentiment, but with practical accuracy. What does this moment actually require? What do I have? What is the honest response? That framework, formed in a boy delivering papers at 5:30 in the morning in the California desert, never left the man he became. 40 years later, sitting in a booth at Ernie's coffee shop and watching a woman balance her professional composure against the specific gravity of a hard season, John Wayne was doing the same calculation. She doesn't need an audience. She doesn't need a story about who left this. She needs the money. Leave the money. Walk out. That's not generosity as a performance. That's generosity as a correct reading of a situation. Dorothy did not find out who had left the $100 that morning. She asked the owner of Ernie's, a man named Gerald Fuentes, if he knew the customer in the booth by the window. Gerald shrugged. He thought the man looked familiar, like somebody from the movies or something, but couldn't place him. The subject was dropped. Dorothy kept the $100. She used it to pay a past-due utility bill. She told Robert about it that evening. She told him a large man with a low voice had told her she ran a good section and left a $100 bill under a saucer and walked out before she could say anything. Robert said, "What did he look like?" Dorothy thought about it. "Like the kind of man," she said, "who didn't need you to know who he was." She would not learn the identity of the man in booth 2 for another 4 years. In 1975, a friend of Dorothy's named Patricia Sullivan brought a copy of a retrospective magazine article to the coffee shop, one of the long-form pieces that had been running in Hollywood publications as Wayne's health became a public concern following his lung cancer surgery and the public interest that surrounded his 1969 Oscar. The article included a photograph. Patricia set it on the counter during Dorothy's break and pointed to it and said nothing. Dorothy looked at the photograph for a long time. It was a film still from one of Wayne's mid-period westerns, The Searchers, 1956, a close shot of his face, the jaw and the set of the eyes unmistakable at 30 years distance. The hands in the shot were visible at the lower edge of the frame. Large hands. The left had a faint scar along the outer edge. Dorothy looked at the photograph for what Patricia would later recall as nearly 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "That's him." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said something that Patricia Sullivan would repeat for the rest of her life to anyone who would listen. "He didn't want me to know." That was the whole point. There is a specific kind of dignity in anonymity that is only possible for people who don't need recognition to validate the action. Most of us, if we are being honest with ourselves, have a quiet accounting ledger somewhere in the back of our consciousness that tracks the good things we've done and measures their worth at least partly by whether they were witnessed. Not because we are bad people, because we are human people, and recognition is a form of feedback, and feedback tells us whether we are doing things correctly. John Wayne spent 43 years in an industry entirely organized around recognition. His face was the product. His name was the brand. The entire commercial apparatus of Hollywood cinema depended on audiences knowing exactly who he was and choosing to pay to see him. He understood that system completely. He worked within it effectively. He was not naive about it. But something in Wayne's formation, that rancher's economy, that delivery route pragmatism, that childhood with a sick father and thin margins, had insulated a part of him from the corruption that recognition can produce in a person if they're not careful. The corruption is not cynicism. The corruption is subtler than that. It is the slow drift toward performing goodness rather than practicing it, toward doing the thing you can talk about later rather than the thing that serves the actual situation. Wayne's response to that drift across his life was consistent. Do the thing that the situation requires, do it without announcement, and walk out before anyone can turn it into a story about you. He did this with money. He did it with time. Members of his production team across multiple decades documented instances of Wayne quietly arranging for crew members dealing with medical expenses or family hardship to receive adjustments in their pay or have certain costs quietly absorbed. Never announced, never attached to his name in any public way, generally discovered only after the fact or by accident. He did it with loyalty as well, which in Hollywood is a rarer commodity than money. When friends or colleagues fell out of favor with studios, when careers contracted or projects collapsed, Wayne had a documented pattern of continuing to associate publicly with those people, showing up to their events, including them in productions when he had the leverage to do so, at a time when the industry's incentive structure strongly discouraged such associations. But here is the particular thing about the gesture in Ernie's coffee shop. The gesture in Ernie's coffee shop had no audience at all. There was no production team. No colleague, no industry context, no social capital to be earned or maintained. There was a woman doing hard work well, a man who could see that clearly, and the question of what the correct response was. He didn't grandstand. He didn't announce. He didn't even let her see him do it. He left the money, told her she ran a good section, and walked out. 3 words. 1 gesture. Both performed with the same quality, honest, functional, and finished before anyone could make something else out of it. In the winter of 1975, John Wayne sat for an interview with a journalist from a national magazine as part of the wave of retrospective coverage that surrounded his declining health and what the industry had begun to quietly acknowledge might be the final chapter of his career. The journalist asked him, at one point, about legacy, about what he hoped people would say about him. Wayne was quiet for a moment. The journalist noted later that it was not the quiet of a man searching for an answer, but the quiet of a man deciding whether the answer was worth the explanation. Then Wayne said, "I hope they say I was straight. Not generous. Not heroic. Not important. Straight. The word is precise." In the vocabulary of Wayne's formation, ranches, cavalry pictures, working lots, the economic desert of the Mojave in the 20s, straight means something specific. It means your accounting is accurate. It means you don't claim more than you're owed. It means when a situation asks something of you, you respond to what is actually there, not to what would be convenient to pretend is there. Dorothy Myers' situation asked something of him on the morning of November 16, 1971. He responded accurately, efficiently, and without ceremony. That was the whole transaction. He didn't need her to know. Knowing would have changed the quality of the thing, would have introduced an element of performance, of story, of the man being seen doing a good thing. The thing he wanted to do was not the thing of being seen doing good. It was just the good thing itself. There's a difference. It sounds subtle. It is not subtle. It is actually one of the most difficult distinctions a person can hold on to across a lifetime of being watched. 37 witnesses were in Ernie's coffee shop that Tuesday morning. None of them saw what happened. One of them knew. John Wayne died on June 11, 1979, at the UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 72 years old. The lung cancer that had taken his left lung in 1964 had returned in the final years of his life and could not be stopped. He had spent the intervening 15 years, between the first surgery and his death, working at a pace that his doctors consistently found alarming. Not because he was in denial about his condition, but because, as Michael Wayne would later explain, his father had a foundational belief that the work itself was the answer. Not to the cancer, to the question of how to spend the time. He made 12 films after his first cancer surgery. Not small ones. The Green Berets, True Grit, The Cowboys, The Shootist in 1976, which many critics consider one of the finest performances of his career. A role about an aging gunfighter dying of cancer, chosen with the kind of clear-eyed self-awareness that Wayne rarely discussed publicly, but clearly possessed completely. Dorothy Myers learned of his death from the television news, the way most people did. She was in her kitchen on the morning of June 12, 1979. Robert called her in from the other room to watch the report. She stood in the doorway. She thought about the booth by the window, the coffee cup, the saucer, the voice that made the room quieter without the room actually getting quieter. She said, "I'm glad I thanked him." Robert said she hadn't known who he was. She said, "I thanked the man who was there. That was enough." Had brought the magazine photograph to Ernie's in 1975, went on to teach high school English in the Burbank Unified School District for 22 years. She retired in 1997. In the final week of each school year, she taught a unit she called, with a title that was purposefully plain, Doing the Thing Right. It was not a unit about John Wayne. It was not a unit about celebrity or Hollywood or the 1970s. It was a unit, assembled from a dozen different stories across different eras, about the difference between performing goodness and practicing it. About the specific, difficult, underrated quality of doing something correct for no one but the situation. One of the stories she always included was the story of a woman she knew who had worked a Tuesday breakfast shift at a coffee shop in Burbank and received a $100 bill under a saucer from a man who was gone before she could see his face clearly enough to ask